My hot take is your resume is not a data sheet. It's not all the information there is to know about you. It's a sales page. And it needs to act like a sales page, which means it needs to be persuasive. It needs to talk about what the hiring manager is interested in, not what you think is interesting necessarily. Now, lots of resumes list out, here's all the things that I've done, and they're all the things that product managers do. And so by doing that, you don't differentiate yourself at all, and you basically just echo what's in the job description.
All right, so welcome back to another episode of One Night in Product Hot Takes Edition, where I go out into the world and find someone who's got something to get off their chest, have a quick chat with them, get straight to the point, find out what's on their chest, try and get it off their chest and into the ears of you, my adoring listeners or viewers. If you feel like being a part of that, why not head over to onenightinproduct.com/hot, where you can grab a slot on my calendar, come and find me and have a chat about whatever's on your mind, and we can share that with the great masses of the product management world. That's onenightinproduct.com/hot. And whatever happens, do remember to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast app, or head over to YouTube, subscribe, like, and do all of that YouTube stuff that I'm still trying to work out. Anyway, enough of me. Let's get straight to the point with Nils Davis's Hot Take. All right, so ahead of me, I see a green screen scene with no things on the green screen, but there's something in front of the green screen, a familiar face that I've seen before. But for those who don't know who you are, I'd like to ask you to introduce yourself, where you are, what you do, and what your hot take is.
Hi, Jason. Thanks for having me on. This is Nils Davis sitting over here. I'm in Menlo Park, California. It's early in the morning versus where you are, which is you're sort of relaxing for the end of the day. I'm just getting started.
Miller time.
I am a former senior product manager. I've been a product manager for literally 30 years and recently have moved into coaching and consulting. And mostly I'm coaching people right now on their resumes. And my hot take is, and it shouldn't be that surprising if you sort of think about it from first principles, your resume is not a data sheet. It's not all the information there is to know about you. It's a sales page. And it needs to act like a sales page, which means it needs to be persuasive. It needs to talk about what the hiring manager is interested in, not what you think is interesting necessarily. Sometimes those align. And it needs to show why you are the solution to the hiring manager's problem. Now, lots of resumes list out, here's all the things that I've done, and they're all the things that product managers do. And so by doing that, you don't differentiate yourself at all, and you basically just echo what's in the job description. What your resume should do is it should say, here's the ways that I've had impact in my career on businesses that are potentially interesting to you as a hiring manager, because maybe you want those same things too, like how you reversed a market share decline, how you beat a competitor, how you made customers a lot happier when they were becoming unhappy and starting to leave, things like that. I see a lot of resumes from product managers, and very few of them do that. There's other problems with the resumes I see as well, but that's the fundamental one. They don't show the actual impact. They just list out the job responsibilities.
So you see a lot of CVs because you're now coaching people on their CVs, and I'm assuming that you try and help them do things to fix that sort of thing, which is, a whole part of the point. But if you had to put a figure on it, if you had to sort of sit there and say, well, actually X% of people have CVs that don't really pass muster, what is X?
So of the people that I see, it's literally 100%. Now, I may be seeing
self-selecting into.
I may be seeing a selection, but even back when I had a job and I was occasionally interviewing people for positions, I wasn't impressed by too much of what I saw. And the other thing is, I would also try to get people to tell me stories about something that was on the resume that might be interesting, that looked like, oh, maybe there's an interesting story behind this little bullet. And they would never be able to do it, which makes me think they were not thinking in those terms. And so this has been a continual thing. I think it's a really important thing to be able to do, to tell the stories of how amazing you are. And literally most people, maybe 100%, can't do it. It's got to be less than 100%. But mostly of the people that I see, it's 100%.
And this definitely tracks with some of my experience. Like, I've helped companies hire for individual contributor and leadership roles. And, you'd probably expect that they get a little bit better at CVs by the time they get to the leadership role because they've had, a bit more practice. But I'm going to ask you, like, I don't know if you do a lot of leadership stuff or if it's mainly IC, but like, do you see it getting better as you go up?
No, unfortunately, I don't. Now, I think, again, it's selection process, right? I'm seeing the CVs of people who aren't being successful. And so maybe there's a whole set of CVs out there that are fantastic, and I just have not seen them. And as I said, I'm sure there are some. And I think the other thing is, as you get higher in leadership, you're more likely to be networking into a job or having a conversation with someone that gets you into the interview process or something like that. So it's much less about the resume opening that door. But even then, I'm really shocked to the number of people that either are VP or C-level product people, or that claim they are, or that's their target, who cannot do this.
But back to my point that I interrupted myself in, like, again, I've seen a bunch of CVs when going to hire for these jobs, and like, I'm really caught in a quandary, right? Because in some ways, I kind of want to put my arms around all of them and hire everyone because, I want people to have jobs, right? I don't, especially in this market as well. I don't want people to be out of work. I want people to be able to support themselves, their families. I want them to be able to do all the things. But it's so heartbreaking in some situations where you just sort of sit there and go, no one's going to hire you off of this CV. And obviously you try and give a little bit of feedback, but you can't give feedback to everyone as well. If you're like going through 100, 200 CVs, it's really tough. So obviously people like you then are able to try and tackle that sort of step by step, person by person. But is there any more systemic solution for this? Like, or is that something maybe you could work on, like some way to kind of fix this at scale so that we don't have people kind of trying to go into job interview processes with like one hand tied behind their back?
It's a really good question, Jason. And so obviously I work with people one-on-one, and if people want to work with me, it's easy to find me on LinkedIn or whatever. And people are always amazed with what I can do in a short time with one of their stories. It's like somebody said yesterday, this is amazing. I've never considered it being framed that way. Something she'd done that she thought was just normal, and she saw, oh, this was actually an amazing thing. So I try to share a lot of how to do that on LinkedIn, of course. And of course, I'll be doing courses and things like that. I think one of the big problems, though, is there's a lot of received wisdom and a lot of training and information about how to do a CV, how to do a resume, that is just not correct. It's incorrect. Like the goal of getting it on one page. The number of CVs I see that are just a wall of text that's unreadable and you can't figure out what's going on and doesn't tell anything about the candidate on one page it's a surprising number, right? But that's not even like a current rule. That's an old rule that doesn't even exist anymore. And then things like your bullet point should be one line. Well, you can't tell a story in one line, literally. I mean, sometimes, occasionally, if you're really lucky, you can get into 1 or 2 lines, but usually it's going to be longer. That means you have to have fewer, and that means it can't just be every single thing you've done. It has to be the high impact things you've done. And so I talk about a lot of these things on LinkedIn. I have a podcast as well where I've talked about a ton of this stuff. And of course, people like you had a great post a few months ago that I responded to, and we had a little interaction about that was about how bad the CVs were and what people should be doing with them instead. Yours was more about symptoms. I try to really talk about what to do about that symptom, But yeah, it's a big problem. And I would love to see more people sort of taking up the banner that I'm waving, which is about make sure you understand your stories and put them into the right structure, and then make your bullets out of the stories rather than just list everything you've ever done. Your resume will be a lot better. You'll be way more prepared for an interview. And you're more likely to get that job. You're more likely to get those interviews if you're doing that.
Is there a little kind of hidden problem here, though, which is, if we follow through your hypothesis there that people should be doing these things, and I agree that they should be doing them, but telling a good story or an attractive story or a story that is going to impress people and be part of your sales pitch in a CV in an interview process kind of supposes that you've actually had any meaningful successes in previous jobs. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that not all product managers have. And I'm certainly going to sit there and, fess up and say that I can look back at particular roles that I worked on earlier in my career where maybe I didn't have like a success that I'd shout about. Do you think there's always a success in there somewhere that can be shouted about? Or do you just have to try and gloss over those things as quickly as possible? So,
a couple things. One is you only need 3 or 4 per job, right? And I believe that generally, if you weren't fired, you probably have some, right? But the interesting thing is that people often don't know that they had those. And one of the reasons to work with a coach is actually to help understand what you did that was amazing. In fact, I always say, to product managers, you're amazing. It just doesn't show up on your resume. And there's got to be at least a few times when you did something that was like, made a difference to the business. Otherwise, you wouldn't even have the job. And you wouldn't have gotten to the next job if you had, from the first one. So I do believe that everybody has some amazing stories. Now, do they have an amazing story from every job? Not necessarily. And I'm not saying every bullet on your resume or your CV needs to really have a great story behind it, because sometimes you don't have it, or sometimes it's just like, I want them to know that I did this particular kind of thing, even though I don't have a great story about it. Them being the, hiring manager, whoever's reading it. But I find that most people have amazing stories that they didn't even know they had.
So what's your process then to try and tease those out? Like, is it just a kind of almost like, tell me about your childhood style therapy session, or do you have like a framework that you go through? Like, how do you get to tease those stories out and maybe emphasizing the parts that do make them special?
Yeah, I do have a framework, and it's very simple. It's not as complicated or difficult as therapy. It's basically, I say, I look for a bullet point on the resume that looks like it might have something interesting behind it, even though it currently doesn't. And then I say, okay, so what was the business problem you were solving here? And then they tell me what the solution was. And I say, that's not what I want. I want the problem. What was going on in the business? What would have happened if you hadn't fixed this? What was the symptom that something needed to be done? And usually it's like, oh, well, I'll prompt them. Like, were you losing market share? And they say, oh, yeah, we were actually. What about competitors? Oh, yeah, we started losing to competitors a lot. And this never came, they didn't even think about this, at least not explicitly. And so we go through that list of things and all the things that were going wrong. And then I don't ask them at all about what they did, because they're really good at already talking about that. And I say, okay, so what happened at the end? Did you reverse market share decline? Did NPS go up? And everyone has a story that fits those criteria, it seems, or some set of criteria for things were going bad, and then I did something, and then things were going much better. And then the other thing that I often do is I do not like double-digit percentage improvements, like, oh, sales went up by 20%. That's not interesting. That's not a compelling number. And I find that there's almost always a way to turn a 20% increase in something to a factor of 5 increase in something else that's also valuable. And so that's another thing I do with folks as well. But as a result of asking them this set of questions about what was the problem, what did you do, and what was the transformation at the end, they also have a great answer to an interview question. It's basically scripted out at that point. And that the really hard part of the whole thing is turning the good story into a relatively short bullet point. And actually, I use ChatGPT to help me with that. I write something, and then I say, ChatGPT, please make this passage shorter. And it usually does a pretty good job. Not always, but it doesn't always keep the most important things, at least from my perspective. So I have to do some rewriting, but that's the magic. That's a ChatGPT secret sauce. I don't think ChatGPT couldn't get you to the story, but it can help you turn the story into a somewhat more compact bullet point. I just told you all my secrets, Jason.
Yeah, so I'm going to go out and start selling that now. I'm sorry, Nils, but I'm sure that you'll find something to do when I take over your business. Or maybe I can just be your UK arm. Who knows? But I'm going to assume, though, that, because there is a danger if you go down this route where maybe you start to almost over-egg the pudding. Like you over-egg your contribution, or you kind of, because you're trying to emphasize the positive and trying to tell that great story, that you maybe go a bit too far. So how do you prevent people from maybe over-egging and making it look like they were way better than they were, or contributed way much more? Or is it all fair in love and war?
Well, I think there's a lot of fairness involved in love and war. And so to some degree, people are like saying, look at how boring I am. I'm putting myself under this sack, so you can't even see that I did anything interesting. And then they have a hard enough time getting the sack off their head, much less standing up and putting on the makeup and turning on the show lights and saying I'm the greatest, right? People have a hard time with that. Not that people don't, of course, think of themselves as really good. People usually do. They say, I'm a great product manager, but it doesn't show up in the resume and it doesn't show up in their story. So there's definitely a danger. I think you're competing with a lot of people who are doing that, most likely. I mean, you got to think who's getting these interviews, right? The people I'm talking to often aren't. So what is it that is causing people to get interviews? Well, it's not having the right keywords, clearly, because these people have keywords up the wazoo in their resumes. It must be people telling great stories about themselves and potentially not telling the truth. I don't know. I don't know what's happening. But, I don't think that's actually too much of a danger, to be honest. People don't do that. The objection that I always hear is, well, okay, the job description has all these keywords in it, and you're telling me to put these stories in that don't have keywords in them. I basically I basically say, don't worry about keywords. I say, okay, you can have a skills section that lists the keywords if you want. But the other thing that I remind people is that when a hiring manager is looking for someone to come in and do a job, they're actually not looking for someone to lead an agile team or write requirements. They're looking for someone to deal with a problem that is either happening or they anticipate it happening or it's been causing problems like market share decline, competitive challenges, trying to figure out what to do with a new technology, having customer dissatisfaction. And guess what? Those don't show up on the job description because they can't admit that publicly, which is what a job description is. So all the things that they're actually interested in are not on the job description. Also, are you an unpleasant person to work with? I mean, they do actually ask that. And you can't actually demonstrate that on the resume, unfortunately. But you can, that's something that if you say in the resume, well, that's a good one. I just opened a can of worms for myself that I don't know how to solve. So let's set aside, are you a jerk for this? I'm not sure you can get that across on the resume that you aren't. But they're not going to put in the job description, market share loss. So I need somebody to come in who's done that. But every product leader is facing that. Either it's happening now or it's going to happen if they don't do the right things. And so if you have a story about reversing market share, particularly in a domain that is of interest to the hiring manager, that's going to make you more interesting than saying, I led an agile team of 8 people.
Just like all the other PMs. Well, I think there's probably much more we could talk about this, but I think the most important thing we could do now is kind of give the listeners an idea where they could come and find you if they want to talk to you about this and get some expert advice.
Well, it turns out that the easiest way to do that is to find me on LinkedIn. And it's very easy. It's my name, Nils Davis. And on my profile page, there's a link to set up a call with me about your resume. It's a free call. It's a huge amount of value. People's resumes are actually transformed on the free call, although usually we extend the engagement as well. And, if you find me there, you can also find my podcast. And I have a number of episodes about resumes and finding jobs and getting the first PM job, which is actually one of the really biggest challenges for me, is when somebody comes in and says, well, my resume is not getting me my first PM job. And that's a big challenge to figure out how to tell that story without saying that you're already a product manager, since you weren't, but surfacing things you've done that are like product management and will make a hiring manager say, well, maybe it's worth having this person in for a conversation.
Well, there you go. I'll make sure to link that all into the show notes, and hopefully you get a few people waving their malformed CVs in your general direction. Well, loads of insights there, but as for now, all I can do, Nils, is thank you for coming and thank you for your hot take.
As always, a pleasure, Jason. Great to talk to you.